So for more on this, Robert Costa and Margaret Brennan join us now. Robert is CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent, and Margaret is CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent, and of course, the moderator of Face the Nation. Margaret, I want to start with you and this sit-down that you had with Warner and Rubio. Let's play a little bit of what they told you, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
Let's start on the news of the moment. I know the two of you were briefed by the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines. Do you have any timeline in terms of when you will get visibility into the documents of classified material that both President Biden and President Trump had in their residences?
Margaret, unfortunately, no. And this committee has had a long bipartisan history of doing its job. And our job here is intelligence oversight. The Justice Department has had the Trump documents about 6 months, the Biden documents about 3 months. Our job's not to figure out if somebody mishandled those, but our job is to make sure there's not an intelligence compromise. And while the Director of National Intelligence had been willing to brief us earlier, now that you've got the special counsel, the notion that we're going to be left in limbo and we can't do our job, that just cannot stand. And every member of the committee who spoke yesterday, and I wanted the director to hear this, regardless of party, said, we are united in we have to find a way to do our job. That means we need these documents. We need that assessment.
But the intelligence community would say their hands are tied because this is an ongoing, active Justice Department investigation. So what would meet the level of addressing your concerns without compromising that?
Well, I don't know how congressional oversight on the documents, actually knowing what they are, in any way impedes an investigation. These are probably materials we already have access to. We just don't know which ones they are. And it's not about being nosy. You know, here's the bottom line. If in fact those documents were very sensitive, materials were sensitive, and they pose a counterintelligence or national security threat to the United States, then the intelligence agencies are tasked with the job of coming up with ways to mitigate that.
So first, I do want to point out just how rare it is to see this bipartisanship on Capitol Hill these days, the chair and the vice chair of the Intelligence Committee. But with that said, I mean, they were both kind of saying the same thing here. What do they want to do, or what can they do to try to get a hold of these documents? Well,
this is one of those few committees, Senate Intelligence, where they really try to pride themselves on being bipartisan, and now they've found this common cause on what is a politically toxic issue for both parties right now. But Senator Rubio made clear he's willing to use the leverage he has in terms of holding up some funding, potentially. He said he's not threatening, but reminding the Director of National Intelligence that he does have to greenlight, as part of the committee, some funding for the intelligence agencies. Other Republican senators have said they would stand in the way of Biden administration nominees from getting confirmed. So there is a willingness to play some hardball. And on the Democratic side of the aisle, you do have Senator Warner essentially indicating that he wants to write new laws here. You know, in the past, you did have some Republican congressmen like Brian Fitzpatrick say, hey, when the Mar-a-Lago raid had happened, can we just go down into a secure facility and view the documents? That hasn't happened. In the case of Biden, there has also been no revelation to the committee members about what the contents of these materials dating back to his Senate years contains. So at a minimum, they want to know what's in it, if not view it, perhaps in one of these secure facilities. But Warner's also saying here that when it comes to overclassification, when it comes to the regulations that govern the executive branch in terms of, you know, just record keeping, maybe that deserves a second look by his committee.
That's really interesting, because I think that's a question a lot of us had over the past week was, okay, now that we have this information, what happens next in terms of classifications? But it's interesting to hear those leverage points that they have there. Bob, I want to talk to you, too, because you spoke with John Bolton, who also knows a thing or two about national security. Let's take a listen to what he had to tell you.
The issue of classified records, you've briefed former President Trump, you've briefed many presidents, you've briefed former Vice President Mike Pence, documents found at his Indiana home. Did it surprise you?
Well, it surprises me because in the Pence case, I can't think of anybody less likely to deliberately try to get classified documents out of his office. I think what we've seen, that there's a pattern, three cases form a pattern. The transition out process for presidents and vice presidents is obviously flawed and inadequate. And
where are the gaps in the system?
I think where they occur, at least in these cases, is the packing out of officers who leave the government. And I suspect in the turmoil of the last days, a lot of things just get packed and they don't get checked. So transitioning in is hard enough. Transitioning out is going to have to become harder because there's got to be greater scrutiny of the documents that the people take to their homes or to their private offices once they leave the presidency or the vice presidency.
So, Bob, Bolton picking up there on this question of, OK, what happens next? But it was interesting what he said about Mike Pence. I'm curious what you make of that.
He said that he does not believe Pence had any ill intention with bringing those documents to his home in Indiana. But there are clearly gaps in the system. And there's also a gap, as Margaret's reporting shows, in terms of what Congress knows about what else is out there. And you now see a lot of former officials wondering what's in their personal files. Should they maybe be taking another peek at their records to make sure there's no classified material in there? Calling around former Trump and Clinton and Obama officials today, it's clear that there's a sense that in the move out, everyone thinks they're checking the box, but sometimes the National Archives isn't really alerted to what exactly is leaving the building. And it's going to be interesting to see if there will be a bipartisan consensus in the coming months in coming together to legislate some kind of parameters for this process.
Yeah, it's interesting to see Congress kind of start to sharpen their elbows when it comes to dealing with holding the administration accountable. Margaret, you also spoke to Warner and Rubio about how much Haines knew. Let's play a little bit of that.
Does the director even know what the materials were?
Well, we got a bit of vagueness on that because, again, I believe you want to make sure the intelligence professionals and not political appointees were making some of that. That makes sense to me. But I would even think that, if President Trump and President Biden would probably want to have this known if they say there's no there there. Well, there may still be violations on handling, but we got to tell the American people and our colleagues, because we're the only ones who have access to this information, that there's not been an intelligence compromise.
Let me tell you how absurd this is. There isn't a day that goes by that there isn't some media report about what was found where, some sort of characterization of the material in the press. I just saw one this morning again. So somehow the only people who are not allowed to know what was in there are congressional oversight committees.
So what Rubio was saying there doesn't entirely seem unreasonable, right? What else did you learn from them?
Well, that's some frustration with Justice Department leaks, right? And here's the thing, with particularly this Director of National Intelligence, she has really, since she came into office, tried to, and she would say this herself, depoliticize what she viewed as an agency that had the perception of politicization around it, particularly at the end of the Trump administration. And what I heard Senator Warner indicating there was exactly that perhaps there is this, as she is the political appointee, unwillingness to dive into some of this and rather have intelligence officials who are career deal with it. But what he's saying is, don't drag this out. And if the Justice Department is going to conduct this investigation, they also do need to share within the intelligence community what exists. And that wall between the two, so far, we have no reporting to believe has been breached. We don't know if the Director of National Intelligence knows, and he said he couldn't get that answer from her either, which I think is really interesting. Yeah. But there are other issues here of bipartisan concern, and that briefing with the Director of National Intelligence wasn't even supposed to be about this. It was supposed to be about bigger national security issues, and that's where they had wanted this committee to really prioritize their focus straight out of the gate on issues in particular regarding China. And we spent a good part of our conversation about that rising military, financial, economic, and technological threat.
Interesting. TikTok, a big public conversation on Capitol Hill these days. But it's so interesting to see the Senate Intelligence Committee exercising some bipartisanship compared to the House side, which has completely seems to have devolved. And Bob, speaking of the former president, Trump is headed to South Carolina this weekend for his first campaign event since announcing his run in November. You asked Ambassador Bolton about how he feels about that campaign and how it's going so far. Let's take a listen to what he had to say and get your thoughts on the other side.
It's going downhill, and I think it'll continue to go downhill. I think Republicans, especially after the November 8 elections last year, see that he's poisoned to the ticket. He cannot be elected president. If he were the Republican nominee, he would doom our chances to get a majority in the Senate and the House. I don't think he's going to be the Republican nominee.
Is Trump a threat to national security?
I think he is. I believe that the damage he did during his term was significant but repairable. I strongly opposed him getting a second term because I worried that what he would do in a second term might be irreparable.
All right, so Bob, some pretty harsh words there from Bolton. What did you make of that? And also, did he say anything about his own presidential ambitions at all?
He said he is seriously considering the idea of running for the Republican presidential nomination. It would likely be a very uphill climb for the former ambassador, and I raised that about fundraising in terms of grassroots organization. Bolton noted he is someone who has thought about running for president before. He thought about the idea going back to 2016. And so you see in Bolton this wing of the Republican Party, I would count former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan as part of it, that sees themselves as traditional Republicans, and they would like the possibility of being up on stage with Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential race. But at this point, they're all wondering, is there enough of a coalition there to mount a competitive bid, not just a bid?
Yeah, something to watch in the coming weeks as people start to make those decisions, or at least publicly talk about them. Robert Costa and Margaret Brennan, thank you so much for your reporting and sharing it with us. And this Sunday, be sure to watch Face the Nation when Margaret sits down with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in an exclusive live interview.